Friend of the program, Senator Tom Cotton is with us. Tom, thanks for coming back on the program, sir.
Hey, Paul, great to be back on with you. Happy New Year's to you and all your listeners.
Absolutely. Happy New Year to you. So what was your reaction, Senator Cotton, when you heard President Obama make that speech on guns?
Well, I oppose the president's gun control proposals because I support Arkansans' Second Amendment rights. I think President Obama's executive actions are unconstitutional, they're ineffective, and they're largely a distraction from his other failures. Unconstitutional because in our system of government, only the people's elected representatives in Congress can change the law. Ineffective because, as we've seen time and again, President Obama's proposals wouldn't have in fact stopped many or any of the mass murders or terrorist attacks we've suffered in this country. If you just take the San Bernardino attacks, for instance, Paul, the terrorist that's committed that atrocity used weapons that were largely already banned under state law. Terrorists and murderers, it comes as no surprise to your listeners, don't tend to walk into Walmart and buy firearms by themselves. They use straw purchasers, they use cutouts, they use the black market. So these proposals would be ineffective, though they would infringe on the rights of law-abiding citizens. Third and final, I think the proposals are largely a distraction away from other failures of the Obama administration. If you look at his record on gun prosecutions under the current laws we have, they've actually declined under the Obama administration. And overseas, President Obama's failed counterterrorism policies have led to the rise of the groups like the Islamic State that have attracted more adherents and followers around the world who are inspired by, if not directed by, the Islamic State to commit the kind of atrocities we saw in San Bernardino and in Paris. So I think we should focus on the real problems we have when it comes to prosecuting gun criminals or fighting Islamic terrorism all around the world to make sure it doesn't come to the United States first. We shouldn't infringe on the rights of law-abiding citizens.
I'm glad that you mentioned San Bernardino and you mentioned ISIS because, I mean, me personally, Senator, and I know a lot of listeners in Arkansas feel the same way, you know, the idea that ISIS has that kind of reach, at the very least, to influence what happened in San Bernardino, I know everybody is on edge, and, you know, we feel more unsafe now than ever, and yet the president thinks basically that the Second Amendment's the problem when I feel the need to arm myself in public more than ever.
Paul, the Second Amendment has a long and rich history, not just in our Constitution, but in the story of the Anglo-American peoples going back to Great Britain. And at root, as important as hunting and outdoorsmanship is to Arkansans, at root, our Second Amendment rights are designed to protect our liberties against any kind of organization or any kind of force that would seek to forcibly overthrow our government and subject us to tyranny. That was the case in the Revolutionary War, and that's the case with a threat like the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda. It's a good thing that so many Americans are armed and ready to defend themselves and their families and their communities. We need to encourage that kind of responsible citizenry, while at the same time we use existing gun laws to keep guns out of the hands of people who don't deserve or need to have them.
I completely agree, and that's an interesting historical perspective there. I'm curious though, and I know we don't want to read too much into the motives. I know there are people on the left that legitimately believe that the Second Amendment seems to be the problem here, but to me, there's maybe also some that, you know, they actually think their ideas are going to solve the problems. How much of President Obama, his ideas, do you think have to do with a problem with just the fact that we can own guns versus he actually thinks this is going to solve the problem? I know that's a speculation on your part, but what do you think?
Well, I'm always reluctant, Paul, to get into people's motives because you never know what's in the heart of another person. But I will say, based on President Obama's own statements, it's clear that he does not think the Second Amendment protects an individual right to keep and bear arms, even though the Supreme Court has twice in the last decade held that it means exactly that, which I think the vast majority of Arkansans would agree with. And I would say, again, historically, the First Amendment is incredibly important. It guarantees our right of thought and expression, whether that's through religious means or through media or through political speech. But words are not enough sometimes. And you saw this at our founding. We declared our independence on July 4th, 1776, but mere words were not enough to secure our independence. It took George Washington and an armed militia to fight for our independence. That's why the Second Amendment comes right after the First Amendment, because sometimes words have to be matched with actions. When you face the kind of threats that we face today from groups like the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, most Arkansans know that you have to be willing to defend your freedom, whether that's fighting in our military or defending it from a terrorist attack.
Very, very well said. So real quick on ISIS, I know you have disagreements with how the president is handling this threat. What do you think? What kind of policy should we advocate going forward to try to deal with this? We've seen them hit at Paris. Now we've seen San Bernardino. What should we do going forward?
Well, Paul, I want to look at the threat that ISIS poses from a couple different angles that should be, I think, reassuring to people, but also concerning. In the short term, from a military perspective, ISIS is not 10 feet tall. We could defeat them in relatively short order if we were committed to the victory. Remember, the Islamic State has about 30 or 35,000 followers in Iraq and Syria. Its territory is no larger than the state of Indiana. They have maybe $80 to $100 million in revenue a month, smaller than many companies in the state of Arkansas, much less a sovereign country. They don't have any industrial capability to build weapons. They don't have anyone who will sell them weapons. They don't have any country that recognizes them diplomatically and has relationships with them. So if we and our allies were committed to defeating ISIS militarily, it's something we could surely do in relatively short order. So that's the reassuring and short-term angle. The longer-term angle, though, Paul, is that we have to fight an ideological war, not just against ISIS, but the Islamic State and Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood, so that we do not face for generations the threat of radical Islamic terrorism. There is a very, very small percentage of Muslims around the world who want to commit acts of terror against the West. But because there are 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, that small percentage translates to a large number. And what we need is the consistency and the support for moderate Muslims all around the world in countries like Indonesia or Jordan or the United Arab Emirates, as well as Muslim leaders in the United States who reject that kind of radical ideology and are willing to help us fight the ideological battles that we'll need to finally eradicate the threat of Islamic terrorism from the world in the long term.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, that's a very comprehensive approach, and I don't disagree with that at all. So I just know that there's a lot of folks that are wondering why the country, America is just not taking more of an aggressive stance. I think some of it, I guess, last question, because I know we're short on time. It doesn't seem that the current administration wants to correctly identify what exactly it is we're fighting. You mentioned not just the Islamic State, but all of the other groups that are associated with radical Islam. I think, and tell me if you disagree or agree, I think we have to correctly identify who our enemy is if we want to actually defeat them.
We do, Paul. That's the first step to defeating your enemy, is understanding your enemy, not just in that short-term military or intelligence fight, but in the long-term ideological fight. I would say that there's a couple things I think are going on with the president's policy. First, he has a oft-stated and long-standing and well-known aversion to the use of military force or even the threat of military force to back up his diplomacy. That aversion is bone deep. You've seen it time and time again. You've seen it in Iraq in 2011. You've now seen it in Iraq and Syria over the last 4 years. You saw it with the Red Line in 2013 when he threatened military action if Bashar al-Assad used chemical weapons. You've seen it in his refusal to supply defensive weapons to Ukraine to defend themselves against the Russian invasion. You've seen it in some measure in the South China Sea, where we sent one ship next to China's artificial islands that they're starting to militarize so they can project power against our adversaries. The president doesn't just have an aversion to using military force. He has an aversion to even threatening military force. And I think you see that playing out against the Islamic State. But the second point, this is more particular about the Islamic State, the answer to most questions in the Middle East is Iran. And if he were to take firmer action in Syria, that would involve confronting the regime of Bashar al-Assad, which would involve confronting Iran, because right now Iran is the main support that Bashar al-Assad gets, because they rely on Syria as their lines of communication into Lebanon, where they support Hezbollah right on Israel's border. And the president will take no action, in my opinion, that threatens to undermine his nuclear deal with Iran. That includes firm action in Iraq and Syria that Iran would protest. Just last week, Iran fired missiles within a couple hundred kilometers, or I'm sorry, a few hundred meters of a U.S. naval ship in the Persian Gulf. They tested ballistic missiles. Now they've burned down the Saudi embassy. The president still refuses to confront them as he promised he would. And I just think that goes to show that he is fundamentally committed to the nuclear deal with Iran, even if it means instability throughout the Middle East.
Yeah, that's true. And you know, we made a deal with, somebody that's just not trustworthy. And the idea of a nuclear Iran is terrifying. I mean, much more so than ISIS. Senator Cotton, I sure do appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today, and I hope we can do it again soon, sir.
Well, thank you, Paul. And again, Happy New Year to you and all your listeners.
All right. Yes, sir. Be safe.